This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Greetings, comrades. Today, we're finally playing this game in its purest form. Realistic mode. The difficulty that turns an already hard and unforgiving game into one of the hardest city building experiences I've ever played. Because starting the game, you have barely any money, your citizens get extremely upset when they accidentally drink poo, and finally, buildings can't appear out of thin air. So every detail has to be planned and executed to perfection, otherwise everyone dies. Which I've been informed is not good. So join me on my journey to build a worker's paradise on the hardest difficulty this game has to offer without killing too many people. Loading into the game, the first thing we had to do was figure out exactly what our goals were. Well, comrades, I'm proud to unveil to you my glorious 10-year plan. The goals were simple: reach a population of 5,000, fill our bank account back up to the starting 1.4 million, and of course survive the ball-crushing experience of playing this game. So with that said, I picked the empty Arabian map, picked a realistic difficulty, and started the game. After having a brief look around the map, I used this time to ponder on whether or not I was ready to subject myself to at least 30 hours of misery, and to find the perfect place for our republic. What we were looking for was somewhere close to the border, near a river, and ideally flat. Thankfully, it didn't take too long before I stumbled across the perfect location in the south. It not only ticked off all of our requirements, but it also had a small deposit of oil just across the river. Very nice. With the location sorted, the next question we had to ask ourselves was, where the fuck do we even start? Like, what do we actually do? Well, a good place to start would be setting up a simple and profitable industry to get our money moving in the right direction. However, factories will require workers, who need a town, and both will require a construction industry just to build them. Since we're playing on realistic, we can't just magically shit out buildings. So, a good place to start would be setting up a construction industry. To quickly run through the opening moves and prove how autistic this difficulty is, I built a petrol station, a distribution office to deliver the fuel to the petrol station, built a handful of construction offices, alongside 4 open storages for each resource we were going to need, a couple more distribution offices to deliver said resources, a bunch of vehicles. I then had to set up all the routes to deliver the resources, and finally, a bus stop to bring in foreign workers, who for now were just being gaslit with promises of work, but instead were being left in the middle of the desert until they vanished. Yeah, sorry about that one, guys. The only thing I could think to offer them while they wait was today's sponsor. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game enjoyed by over 95 million players on PC, consoles and mobile. With over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships from 10 different nations, you can roll into battle with vehicles from the 1920s all the way to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Each vehicle is incredibly detailed, allowing you to choose exactly how you wish to ruin your opponent's day. Whether that's by camping in the bush, taking in the stunning graphics and authentic sound effects, or decimating your opponents in a supersonic jet. Personally, I enjoy driving a Tiger around with my good friend Hazor, so if you're hovering around the 5.7 tier, you might just see us out there. Anyway, play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox or mobile by using my links down in the description and pinned comment. New and returning players that haven't played in 6 months on PC and console will receive a massive bonus pack that includes 100,000 Silver Lions, Vehicle Decorator Eagle of Valor, a handful of premium vehicles, and 7 days of premium. This pack is only available for a limited time, so don't miss out. Thanks again for War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Now back to it. With our resources being delivered, the next thing to do was to plan out our road network. Using dirt roads, I laid out the main roads and a vague idea of where everything was going to be. Industry here, housing blocks here and all the city infrastructure somewhere in the middle. Or at least something like that. With visions of my Grand Republic now burnt inside my mind, I began placing down the critical infrastructure our population will require. A hospital to keep them alive, a small shopping centre for goods, a pub that will slowly kill them, the wrong type of dumpsters because I'm a moron, a cinema, a swimming pool, and finally, all the utilities. Before we started construction though, I thought it'd be a good idea to upgrade the main roads because I may have planned the town a little far away from the customs house. And since I had just spent 30 minutes planning this all out, I had no intention of moving it. So I had the dumpers spread it so we could erect our new roads. You dirty whore. And during construction, we ran into classic Soviet logistical issues, with all our resources being delivered to one place and all the workers being delivered to another. Excellent work, fellas. While our roads are being upgraded, I planned out our first residential block. The plan was to have this one within walking distance of our industry, so we didn't have to worry about transportation. Once our roads were done, things began moving in the right direction, and our town slowly came to life. First thing to go up were our apartment blocks, then the shopping centre, the hospital, the cinema, the school, and before long, it was time to bring in some workers. I say before long, it had been over 3 hours since I had started this game. And this is what we had. Before inviting our first batch of workers, I quickly set up a few trade routes which will keep our people alive. For starters, I imported water via truck, alongside food and other goods they'll need, and finally a truck to export our poo. I then gave our republic the great name of Sandy Balls, and I think we can all agree, it's time for some workers. To get started, I invited around 100 people to test the waters, as I didn't want to invite too many people at the cost of 400 each, just for them to die. And it's a good thing I was cautious, because immediately I noticed I was missing both a kindergarten and meat. Panicking, I accidentally bought a ridiculously oversized meat lorry, and then built a kindergarten that was far too small. After ironing out a handful of smaller issues, I realized I had spent 600,000 of my starting 1.4 million. And I was starting to get a little nervous that I was going to run out of money. To bring down our expenses, instead of importing Soviets at the cost of 4,000 rubles for 10 workers, I instead invited immigrants from the third world. Costing only $700, the downside is they arrive in poor health and uneducated, which wasn't too much of a problem because I had an abundance of doctors and plenty of space at the school. With our new workforce being educated, it was time to plan out our first industry. We needed something that was low maintenance and wasn't too expensive to set up. A few industries I considered were clothing, as it's highly profitable and relatively easy to set up. Another idea was food. Another was crude oil, because that technically wouldn't require any workers, but selling oil isn't exactly the most profitable thing to do. With all that considered, I decided to go with a distillery. For starters, producing alcohol only requires crops and water, and it would also reduce our imports, as our workers could drink our glorious vodka. So, I placed down the distillery and then a warehouse behind it to store the crops. Initially, I was thinking about placing down a grain storage with a capacity of 11,000 tons, but that might have been a little overkill, as it requires something like 1,000 tons of concrete to build. And besides, there's nothing wrong with my small warehouse, right? Next, I placed down an even smaller warehouse to store our alcohol, and finally, another distillery which we'll build later. I also planned out a railway between the warehouse and the customs office, which we can use to import crops later on, but to start with, we'll just be transporting everything via truck. To build our railway, we needed a rail construction office and a track builder. Now, some of these were really expensive. 130,000? Fucking hell. Yeah, I think I'm going to stick to the simple but effective AGMU track builder for just 16,000 rubles. However, I had made a slight mistake purchasing it, as I wasn't able to get it out of the customs office. Since I had bought it fully assembled, it required a railway to get out, which of course, we only had the concept of a railway. So, I went to sell it, and this is where I found out it was going to cost me money to sell the vehicle. What the fuck? Why should I have to pay to sell something I just bought by accident? What I should have done is bought it under the disassembled category so we could transport it to the construction office via truck. To be honest, none of this really mattered, as just as I was sorting all this out, the game crashed. Like, for real, I'm not reverting 3 months of progress just to save a few thousand rubles. With that said, being put back a few months meant I had to redo everything. One of those things being water. Annoyingly, the location I originally wanted to build our small well had a water quality of 94%, and to produce alcohol we needed 95%. So, I was going to have to build it closer to the river, where the quality was higher, but it meant that we were going to have to spend more money building piping, which is really expensive. While we laid both pipe and track at an incredibly slow pace, I took this opportunity to begin filling the warehouse with crops with our fleet of trucks. This may not have been the best of ideas, as it caused a little bit of traffic at the customs house, but I wasn't going to worry about that.
A few moments later.
Okay, maybe I should worry about that. Eventually, it was time for the grand opening of our distillery. Opening the doors, I let in the first wave of workers, and production of alcohol had begun. I won't lie, I sat back proud of what we had achieved. For about 15 seconds. During construction, I had forgotten to set up a sewage tank, so after producing a measly 1.32 tons of alcohol, we had to shut down. Damn. Up until this point, you may remember we were exporting our poo via truck. However, unless I wanted a fucking armada of poop trucks, it was probably a good idea just to dump our waste into the river. But that meant we had to build even more expensive piping, and I'll be honest, the bank account was not looking too healthy for a republic that was only exporting its shit. So after waiting ages for the sewage pipes to be set up, it was time for the second grand opening of the distillery. This time, we were open for about 2 minutes. What was the reason for the shutdown, you may be asking? Well, that would be because our water quality had dropped by 1%. Yep. With 94% water quality, we couldn't produce alcohol. For some bizarre reason, possibly related to the fact that I'm dumping sewage in the river, we were going to have to start treating our water. Upon further review, it turns out I'm just an idiot, as the well only had 94% quality to start with. Oops. I had tried to set this up as cheaply as possible, and unsurprisingly, this has come to bite me in the ass. So to set this up properly, I needed a water treatment center, which will treat the water by a whole 1%. To be fair, it's not the end of the world, as our railway was still nowhere near complete, even though I had bought another track builder to try and speed things up. Plus, this wasn't the only sad news I had, as let it be noted that on September 13th, 1961, we had suffered our first deaths. Damn. Anyway, with everything set up for the third time, it was time to what? Just as I was about to be ready to fucking earthquake? Yep. We got hit by an earthquake. Anyway, with the earthquake out of the way, I opened the distillery, and I'm pleased to report that nothing went wrong. We had high quality water being pumped in, sewage that was being pumped out, and a large stockpile of crops to produce a ton of alcohol. A few moments later, a truck arrived to pick up our first export in nearly 2 years. A whole 6.5 tons of alcohol, which was gonna make us 1,709 rubles. Congratulations everyone, we were finally a functional republic. However, a sense of dread washed over me upon reviewing our exports. I noticed the staggering amount of money we were spending on exporting wastewater. Investigating, I noticed that our sewage tank in the city was full, and when it was emptied, it rapidly filled up. This meant sewage was backing up into everyone's houses, and there might be a slight possibility that everyone was drinking poo. Panicking, I hooked up the town's sewage tank to our outlet to dump the poo into the river. This, however, was going to take a really long time to build and cost us a fortune. Why I didn't set up a sewage switch? I don't know. Alright, I panicked, as this wasn't the only issue we were dealing with, because we were also running out of water. Yeah, turns out importing water via truck was fine when you have around 100 people in your city, not okay when you have nearly 1,000. With life expectancy rapidly declining because the only thing people could drink was poo, I sprung into action hooking up our town to our treatment plant. But all this was going to take time. Time which was going to cost us the help of our citizens. Their health dropped from a massive 88% all the way down to 73%, and the average life expectancy had dropped to a low of 54. Happiness, on the other hand, didn't really move, which asked questions I didn't really want the answers to. With a death spiral narrowly avoided and life expectancy starting to climb, I'm pleased to inform you that I did have some more good news. A little while ago, our railway was completed and we had purchased our first train. Now able to import 320 crops per delivery, our trucks could now focus on exporting the booze and not causing a massive traffic jam at the customs house. In our first month, we exported a grand total of 15,000 rubles worth of alcohol. Now at this point, we had a population of around 1,000. However, only 500 of them were workers, and each distillery could accommodate 100 of them. I might be wrong here, but each worker only does an 8-hour shift. So for my distilleries to operate at full efficiency, we needed 300 workers each. So I started bringing in the foreign workers to fill up the plant while I trained up a new wave of immigrants. Over time, our exports crept up, and in March 1962, we had our first positive month. Well, kinda. We had exported more than we had imported, but the cost of new vehicles and manpower meant we were technically in the red, but don't worry about it. We still had 116,000 rubles, which was enough for my next grand idea. Since we were already importing crops, I thought it'd be a good idea to start producing our own food. So after a quick improvement to our water network, I built a big old food factory in that nice little gap between the distillery and our housing block. Something I didn't think was going to cause too many issues, because our average life expectancy was back on the rise after our little poo drinking incident. Once the food factory was built, we slashed our imports while also exporting any excess food we produced. Not that we were producing much, as I had limited the amount of workers to 40. With around 50,000 rubles in the bank, that loan button was looking very appealing. We could borrow up to 2.4 million rubles, but taking loans does sound a little capitalist. Anyway, one of my main expenses was importing smart people. Every time I had a sudden spike in deaths, it always seemed like they were the ones to die. What I'm basically trying to say is, I need to breed some smart people. And then keep them alive. So after finishing whatever I was researching, I made my university's focus on just educating the masses. That should begin the slow increase of smart people, but now I needed to reduce the amount of people dying. And you may be wondering what was causing a significant drop in health. Well, that would be alcohol. Alcohol addiction had been creeping up ever since I had built my first distillery. Don't get me wrong, it's not as bad as my previous videos, but it was definitely having an effect on my population. So naturally, I decided the best way to solve this was to knock down the pub. And this may have upset a few people. Happiness plummeted all the way from 70% down to 59%. But on the flip side, health rose by 6%. With happiness dropping so low, we unfortunately had our first escape, which made me very sad. However, banning alcohol did not stop the masses of people from dying. The moment I crossed 2,000 population, suddenly 10% of them just decided to die. So I think we can all agree that banning alcohol did not work. So it must be something else that's causing everyone to die, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Anyway, I reversed my policy and rebuilt the pub. Before its grand opening though, I researched alcohol standards to reduce the impact on our workers' health, and just like that, happiness was back up to 67%. However, the damage was already done to our citizens' loyalty. What we needed was some good old-fashioned propaganda to get them back into believing in the government. But I was too poor to build a radio station, so it was time to invest in a new industry. Having a quick look around the map, we had a small deposit of oil just across the river. So I planned out a small drilling operation, which consisted of 4 pump jacks and a shed load of piping. To reduce our costs, I filled in the river to create a bulge, so we only had to build a small bridge, saving ourselves over 100 ton of bricks and a bunch of work days. Now I won't lie, all this was going to take an incredibly long time to build and cost an absolute fortune for, let's be honest, very little return. But by the time we finished building all this, I hoped I'd be relatively close to researching refinery designs. Anyway, fast forward about an hour, and it was done. But we were broke. So incredibly broke. In fact, we were so poor, we couldn't even afford the trucks to export the oil. Not that that really mattered, because my dumbass had built a horse distribution office. Now with 7,000 rubles, we could afford to export our oil via horse, which could travel at a jaw-dropping 17 kilometers an hour and deliver a massive 0.95 tons per delivery. Yeah, I think I'm gonna pass on that one. Once I knocked down the horse office and replaced it with one that can actually house trucks, I purchased a glorious tanker made by our Czechoslovakian brethren and made our first delivery, which netted us a grand total of 160 rubles. Yeah, I won't lie, I was a little disappointed by this. And just to top it off, we hadn't even finished researching fuel processing. Since we didn't have enough money to buy any more trucks from the Czech, it was time to dip our hands into the secret reserve of dollars. Building a dirt road to the closest Western Customs office, I purchased some slightly faster and slightly bigger oil tankers from America. Now, I might come across here as a little anti-Soviet, but goddamn does the US know how to build an oil tanker. With our new fleet of American-made trucks, it did start to pay off as we were exporting around 5 to 10k rubles a month. While we were waiting for our research to finish up, it was finally time to address the elephant in the room. One problem I'd been dealing with was the alarming amount of people dying every year. Now, I don't want to point fingers, but looking at the average life expectancy on each apartment block, I noticed something alarming. The people who may live next to the food factory might have been dying in their 40s, while the people on the other side of town were allegedly living around 20 to 30 years longer. Now, I'm no expert, so I can't quite put my finger on why all the people living next to the food factory are dying, but to play it safe, let's build them all some new apartments on the other side of town. Once they were built, I began relocating all the workers, and wouldn't you believe it, their average lifespan began to rise. Congratulations everyone, we had solved the epidemic of people dying young. But it's a shame we never quite figured out on why they were dying, but I suppose that doesn't really matter, let's move on. Building all those apartments had taken me hours, and I'll admit, as much as I like the look of Type 75 prefab flats, they did seem to take a long ass time to build. Eventually I found some flats under the large category that could house 180 workers, so they're the ones I spanned for the rest of the game. Anyway, it had taken me so long to build them, we had finished researching all the techs required for our refinery. Not that I really had the money to build it, but I thought I'd at least get started on the groundworks, as this phase wouldn't cost us too much. However, the 301 tons of steel and 62 tons of mechanical components, they were going to cost us a lot of money. Made worse by the fact the moment I finished the groundworks phase, the price of iron skyrocketed. Like, look at this bullshit. The price had essentially doubled, driving the price of steel through the roof. So yeah, believe it or not, construction was halted and we kind of just sat around doing nothing. This was a good opportunity, however, to rebuild my funds. I had been hovering on around 2,000 to 3,000 rubles, which is not the best place to sit, because the moment I ran out of money, the city's power switched off, and this caused a few issues. Anyway, I then remembered I still had around $400,000. The only downside of buying resources from the west was it was going to take a really long time for our trucks to drive there. But I didn't have anything better to do on my Wednesday afternoon, so I sent them west. Plus, by the time they arrived, the prices still had stabilized, and on March 8th, 1966, we finished construction with 2 rubles in the bank. Once my workers had been bussed over, my fleet of tankers began exporting the much more profitable fuel and bitumen, and my bank account started to recover. Up until this point, our exports had been around 40-ish thousand a month. A month later, we were exporting over 80,000 rubles worth of product. And that's with the refinery only averaging 30 to 40 people at a time, with the productivity of some individuals being as low as 39%. Ever since the Great Poo Drinking incident, the loyalty of our citizens had been trickling down and we had hit a low of 35%, and I wanted to bring that back up. So I built a radio station to pump out endless waves of propaganda directly into the skulls of our population, and very slowly did their loyalty begin to climb. However, let's be honest with ourselves and just admit the primary way to increase production was just to have more workers. So I built some more apartments, a lot more apartments, and of course I continued our policy of inviting people from the third world. Over time, the population of our Grand Republic climbed from 2,000 to 3,000, all the way to 4,000 in the space of the next 4 hours. With the increase of workers every month, our exports grew alongside our consumption of oil. So after expanding the oil fields and building a railway to export our product, we were now exporting over 200,000 rubles a month. 65,000 being made up with alcohol, 65,000 worth of fuel, and 56,000 worth of bitumen and a little bit of food. Like, these were real exports, not like that one video where I lied. With the money pouring in and it only being 1968, the only thing left to do was to continue growing our population to 5,000 and growing our bank account up to 1.4 million. And I'm pleased to report both of these goals were achieved by September 9th, 1969. For the first time, we had actually achieved something in this game on time. I had gotten a little lazy and had just crammed in as many apartment blocks as possible, but hey, it's done. In the end, our Grand Republic had cost the lives of 7,760 people and 124 had escaped. But at least we had completed our 10-year plan. I'll admit, I think I'm kind of done with this game for now, but if you really want to see more, give this video a like and I'll draw up some new ideas. As always, I want to say thank you for watching, and thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget you can play for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox or mobile by using my links down in the description and pinned comment. New or returning players who haven't played in 6 months on PC or console will receive a massive bonus pack that includes 7 days premium, multiple premium vehicles, alongside a handful of other bonuses. This pack is only available for a limited time, so don't miss out. And of course,